All right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. So, sorry about Monday. Suddenly got really sick on Sunday night, so um, I'll have kind of just a make up for that. I'll post some slides and probably record a lecture, but for you guys, that'll be kind of optional. Um, yeah, so the midterms that you guys just got back, look over them. If you have any questions, as David mentioned, you can ask David or Joey, or you can ask me. Yeah, happy to clarify things. Um, the survey question at the end of the midterm, I thought it was kind of interesting. I actually have never asked this before. I was just kind of interested. Um, this is the results of the survey. Uh, the one in the green is about attendance, and so we didn't see any difference actually between people who attended every lecture, if you watch recordings or if you only looked at the slides. So yeah, I guess that doesn't mean don't come to lecture. Um, yeah, but it works for some people to learn via the other ways. But actually, with the AI, there was actually a really big difference. So people who don't use AI at all on homeworks tended to have the highest midterm score, so 80% on average. People who use AI mainly to double check work was 5% lower at 75. And then people who used AI on problems that they couldn't figure out had the lowest at 70. The other two were like not enough people were selecting those, so this isn't really significant. But these, yeah, that's actually a massive difference. So I was a little bit surprised. Maybe that will encourage me to push you guys to try and minimize the use of AI. Maybe you're learning better. It's not like a totally causal relationship, so I'm not totally making that conclusion from this, but anyways, thought it was interesting, um, and maybe that can help you guys in the future. All right. Any questions on the midterm? Not like, I don't want to get into details on specific questions or anything, but if there are any like high level questions. No? Okay. So today we are going to be talking, we're kind of starting, let's say, kind of a new section on policies. So we're going to cover for this next couple weeks uh, policies related to EVs. We're going to do kind of state and local first, focusing on California. And then we're going to be talking at the national level and then international. Then we'll look at some subsidies and incentives um, as a way to kind of round out the sort of EV policies. Yeah, so I didn't make these slides. These are slides from a colleague of mine, Professor Dan Sperling. He was also in civil and environmental engineering, but he retired very recently. Um, and yeah, so I don't know if anyone actually knows Dan. He is, in addition to being a professor in civil environmental engineering, he served on the board of the California Air Resources Board for many years. And so he is like super knowledgeable about policy in this area. And in fact, he was responsible for helping develop it and passing a lot of it during his tenure as a board member. And so, yeah, all that having been said, I'm kind of just stealing some of his material since it's kind of very well scoped and covers basically everything we need to know about EV policy in the state of California. Okay, so future of EVs, we think about this idea that uh, technological determinism versus social determinism. So do we think the technology from society determines the development of its social structure and cultural values, or society itself is the force that shapes technology? Um, and so I think if it were the case that EVs were kind of the latter, or sorry, the former, that technology determines the development. Maybe this as a technology may have come about sort of on its own in the sort of past history. Um, but Dan's contention, which I sort of generally agree with, is that this technology is mostly socially determined. Um, if California had not done some of the things they had done in the first place, it's probably unlikely that EVs would have kind of gained traction and come about in the way that it did over the last 15, 20 years. We'd probably be kind of plodding along with gas cars and hybrid vehicles. Um, it was not the market that pushed for EVs to be adopted. It was policy that like forced automakers to build electric vehicles. Um, and so, if that's kind of your thesis, right, then you want to create effective policy solutions to push this technology forward. And so we're going to look at kind of the laboratory for doing that, right? Which is really what had happened in California, not just over the last 15 years in which we've seen electric vehicles come, but actually over the last, I guess at this point, 35, 40 years. So we've talked about like from the social perspective why we're pushing this, right? So just to reiterate, um, you know, if if carbon dioxide wasn't a problem uh, for society, we could just go on driving gas cars, and that wouldn't really be a problem, right? This whole transition is really happening as an imperative to reduce our climate input impact. Um, we've looked at the sort of motivation that the bulk of emissions, of GHG emissions in California comes from transportation, and the bulk of transportation emissions come from passenger vehicles. And so EVs are kind of by far the most important strategy to essentially decarbonize. Um, Automakers, there is, yeah, this kind of push and pull. You'll hear automakers complain about some of this regulation, and I don't think that's too unfair for them to do so. Um, but the policy is the thing that really pushes them to produce this technology, right? And I think so. Here he lists kind of the role of policy. We want incentives for vehicle purchase that helps on the demand side to get people to want to buy the vehicles. You want charging infrastructure, right, so that people can actually fuel the vehicles. You want requirements for automakers, and then a whole bunch of other um, other policies that are maybe smaller in category than these other ones. But those are kind of our big three. And we're going to focus, I think, primarily on mandates today. The other two we'll kind of touch on here and there, but we'll get into more detail next week or the week after that. The mandates on automakers, one thing that I want to kind of make clear is that it's not as though one automaker or other is like totally against electric vehicles, right? You may have automakers who want to produce electric vehicles, but one of the things that's really important is that in this really well-developed gas car market, you may not necessarily succeed in such a competitive market without sort of policy support in some way, right? And so let's say I was a benevolent automaker and I decided I wanted to produce EVs, but at the start of a new technology, right, things are more expensive. I try to sell these cars, it's harder against the competition, and I just go out of business, right? And so the like relying on the altruism of a particular automaker to produce, a climate combating technology is probably not a good strategy. You need policy to like level the playing field and make everyone kind of do it. And so we'll think about how this happens. Um, yeah, in California. Yeah, there is a question of if it's even possible to electrify everything. And so I'm not going to get too much into this. We've talked um, in some detail about some of the challenges that it would take to kind of replace all of the EVs, right? Whether that's from a perspective of affordability, whether that's from a perspective of like having enough charging infrastructure. Um, it's a hard question, and whether or not EVs can actually satisfy all of the demand and travel needs that people have. This is the balance that we need when we're making good policy, right? You don't want to make it so that people reduce their ability to get from point A to point B, reduce their ability to use cars in the ways that they want. Okay, I'm going to back up for a little bit and talk more generically about why we might want government's intervention. Um, so I don't know how many folks here have taken economics class before, um, but typically we discuss this idea of government intervention really needing to come into play in the presence of something known as a market failure, right? And so we operate in generally what's considered kind of a free market, right? So you have suppliers and consumers, and suppliers are setting prices, and consumers are buying things depending on their wants and needs, and relative to kind of the prices that they're able to afford. And so that generally you allow the market to kind of play out, but there are exceptions in which the market will operate inefficiently or in ways that essentially we don't want, right? And oftentimes those are having to do with market failures. So there's a whole bunch of examples of different market failures. We're not going to get so detailed into all of these. But for example, one example of one of the classic examples of a market failure are externalities. Most people think of externalities as negative, although it is possible to have positive externalities. But the classic example of an externality is basically when you have a transaction for goods and service. So you have a supplier and a consumer, they transact, and the transaction itself may affect people who had nothing to do with that transaction. So the example of this would be, okay, you guys decide to use Unitrans, so you hop on the bus, right? And so I know it's free for you guys, but that money comes from essentially like your tuition and fees, right? So there is a transaction happening where you are essentially paying money to use that bus service, and that bus service provides you the ability to use the bus to get from point A to point B. Great, so you've exchanged money for service, and that's all fine. But for a diesel bus or a natural gas bus, yeah, the Unitrans buses, the non-electric ones are run on natural gas. So they are combusting fuel and so emitting some local pollution. And so pedestrians who are walking by that had nothing to do with that transaction, they're breathing in that dirty air. And so they are affected by your use of the bus, even though they had nothing to do with it. So that's where we think, oh, government needs to step in and provide some kind of solution to this problem, right? And so with environmental or energy externalities, there are particular sets of solutions that we talk about, like a carbon tax. But the idea is the sort of general impetus is that when you have these market failures, whether it's an externality or a market power type of market failure, you need the government to do something about it. So across these different market failures, what is it that the government can actually do? What are the possible policies? So we have a picture here of the carrot and the stick. We characterize this analogy is a pretty common to describe the difference between a regulatory instrument, which is basically saying, oh, you guys have to follow some kind of rules or you have to do something, right? In the transportation realm, in the realm that we're talking about with new technologies, this might be a requirement for the automaker to sell a certain volume of electric vehicles, for example, right? And if they don't do this, they face like fines and penalties and that sort of thing. We have standard requirements, and so this might be greenhouse gas emissions or fuel efficiency performance standards. Both of these we're going to talk about next week. Greenhouse gas performance standards are like your vehicles on average can't emit more than some amount of CO2 or they have to be at least, on average, the new vehicles you have to sell have to meet like 35 miles per gallon or 36, 37. So those are performance standards, and if you don't meet them, there could be criminal liability, there could be huge fines and penalties. For fleets, one of the ways that they do this is they literally require, certain fleets that they have control over, that they just have to have a certain percentage of vehicles or buy a certain percentage of vehicles that are electric. One of the big ones in the recent years under the Biden administration, one of his first executive orders that required to electrify all post-service vehicles. So your mail carriers, all of those are switching to electric, or were, not anymore, for maybe obvious reasons. Yeah, so we consider these regulatory instruments, and they are kind of considered like sticks, right? Because if you don't do this, we're going to punish you, essentially. On the other spectrum are these carrots, which are kind of incentives, right? So these are often market instruments where they're not punishing you, but rather, I guess tax might be considered a form of punishment, but these are instruments that work through the market as opposed to explicit requirements. So one way to do this is you make certain things more expensive. So that would be like a tax on gasoline or diesel. You could have, a high fee on a gas car and low fees on EVs. You could do subsidies. We've kind of touched on this throughout the class, and we'll talk in a lot more detail about this next week. Tax credits, rebates. And then you could also subsidize infrastructure to indirectly support the technology. You could also have non-monetary incentives, so things like access to carpool and HOV lanes, actually of which have proven to be, yeah, quite valuable for a lot of folks. You have like preferential parking, for example. You see, if you go to some big parking lot, you might see at the front it's like little placards for like, oh, this is EV parking only or clean vehicle parking only. This is a type of incentive that's not monetary. And then, of course, Dan's favorite, fee baits. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit. Any questions about this? There is a lot to think about to design good policy, okay? Is it fair and equitable? Is it going to be effective? Is it economically efficient? Is it a good design? Is it easy to administer? So these are things that I'll encourage you guys to think about as we go through a lot of the policies in this class. And I'll try my best to kind of touch on these. But if I'm not talking about it and you're wondering about it, feel free to ask, and I can happy to expand. When I say that California is kind of the sort of living lab, the kind of test bed for this stuff, that really is true, right? So California really does have probably the most comprehensive set of laws and regulations to decarbonize transportation. And not just transportation, in many other places as well, but transportation in particular has gone through a whole lot of different laws, bills, and regulations that many other regions, countries in the world have kind of looked to and emulated in many ways. And this goes kind of all the way back. The ZEV mandate, which we're going to spend some time on today, goes all the way back to 1990. But I would say probably a lot of what has happened, a lot of the ramp up of what has happened has been really kind of affiliated with AB 32, which is this law that was passed in 2006. Yeah, signed by none other than Republican Governor Schwarzenegger, but is actually the impetus for many of the most aggressive decarbonization policies. Yeah, in the past 2 decades. So you can see California has a really rich and active history, throughout different administrations for decarbonization, fighting climate change, especially in the transportation sector. Any questions? Yeah, so I think there's a lot more than what's just listed here, but I would say that these policies are probably the most prominent one. And we're going to talk about a lot of them, especially the ones that relate to electric vehicles. But maybe as a just quick rundown, first instantiation of the ZEV mandate in 1990, AB 1493. These were greenhouse gas standards. The first GHG standards in the world. There's a whole fascinating history of this that we're going to talk about in the federal policy lecture that we'll have next time. There's a whole fascinating history. It is a state level one, but it has big impacts at the federal level. And again, I'll talk about that next lecture. AB 32, as I was just mentioning, is like the impetus for most climate policy in California. SB 375. So we're not going to talk about this in this particular policy in this class, but just for folks' awareness, right? EVs is not the only way that we're trying to decarbonize. They tried to tackle on the demand side, like essentially getting people to drive less. That's a very hard problem. I think that's actually a lot harder than the like EV transition, but it's one of the first policies ever that has tried to tackle that. So this is reducing actual use of vehicles, and that was SB 375. I have mixed feelings about how successful it was, but yes, there's continued push in this area. LCFS is a really important one for decarbonizing fuels. We'll talk about this a little bit more today. And then ACC 1, which relates to the ZEV mandate, and ACC 2, we'll also discuss today in a lot more detail. SB 32, this is a continuation of AB 32 to essentially make it a little bit more aggressive and push out the requirements even kind of farther along and meeting more aggressive targets. We have this ZE buses and ZE trucks, the ACT policy that we had talked before, to push electrification in the like medium heavy duty space. Also in 2018, there was this Governor Newsom made a executive order to meet carbon neutrality by 2045, and that kicked off like a second round of big policy push to decarbonize. Okay. So, supporting ZEVs, kind of the initial push for this, all the way back in the 1990 policy, was to improve air quality, which is an important topic, right? We've kind of talked about this a couple times now in this course. Decarbonization is I think, a sort of newer goal, but the idea that air quality has been kind of poor in many areas in California, that's been a big motivator to decarbonize and push for this technology. And it may be an important thing that we can fall back on when the federal government is less enthusiastic about decarbonizing. Climate change obviously has been a big justification for this. Talked about this. Stimulating domestic economy, industrial policy. So if you can strengthen the economy by starting up this new technology development in the places where to promote onshoring, right, as opposed to relying on manufacturing from other countries, you're kind of strengthening your economy. So companies like Tesla, like Rivian, like Lucid, these are all made in the U.S. for some time, made in California. Although, Tesla has kind of moved out of California, but that's one of the motivations and justifications for having these policies. And then national security, so tied to the economy piece with jobs, but then access to minerals, and then the really big one is reducing reliance on foreign oil imports. Yeah, so why California in particular? Well, one, actually, that's probably it's not on the slide, but California is one of the largest economies in the world, right? And so they have the economic power to try and do some of this stuff. As I mentioned, air pollution in California is really bad. Also, from a climate change perspective, right? California is kind of uniquely vulnerable in many ways. So sea level rise is a big one. Many of our big cities are located right on the coast, so there is some intrinsic motivation to try and reduce damage as much as possible. Extreme weather events, so I'm sure you guys are all aware of like the devastating wildfires that have happened in the state, many of which are attributable to climate change. And so mitigation of climate change is important in regard to trying to reduce that, or keep it from getting even worse, I should say. And many other important industries are affected by climate change, right? We are the agricultural capital of not well, agricultural capital of the U.S. For food, and then economic benefits. A lot of our technology industries in the U.S. are located in California. Huge research communities, right? So that includes, universities like ours, but also research labs. You've got LBNL that does a lot of work in this area. Lawrence Livermore Lab is in California as well. Yeah, so many reasons for California to be motivated to have these policies. And then, yeah, we have unique authority to do this. Um, yeah, so I'll talk about this right now, and I'll kind of revisit this in the federal lecture. But way back in the 1970s, when the federal government passed their Clean Air Act, uh, it was actually preceded by California's Clean Air Act, which was already in place at the time. And so when Congress passed the federal Clean Air Act, uh, the standards were actually not as strict as California's. And so they included in the 1970s within the Clean Air Act specific sections of that act that actually gave California the authority to continue having their own Clean Air Act as long as it was more stringent than the national standards. And so normally this is not something that states would be allowed to do, right? A state regulatory authority cannot override a federal rule. But in this case, we were granted the authority to do that. Um, Not only that, other states could choose to opt into either the federal requirements or California's requirements, and that'll play into the conversation about some of this stuff a little bit later on. So there are a number of other states that follow specific rules set by California, and so whenever California changes those rules, the states can opt to join in on those, and that has been the case for a number of states across the country. Any questions about that? There is a little nuance there. It's not that like California can just make up any rules and then California and other states have to follow. If they want to do updates to things regarding air quality and greenhouse gases and air quality standards, they have to petition the government, the federal government. They have to ask for what's known as a waiver from the US EPA. And that's going to become a really important like political issue, as we'll see next class. So I'll kind of briefly um, revisit that next week, and then I'll hold off on this last point as well because we'll talk about this in a lot more detail on Monday. Yeah, so I'm gonna skip this one as well. We're gonna talk about that in more detail. Um, yeah, so California on the standards, this is all gonna get addressed a little bit later. Um, the idea that probably what I want to emphasize most is that California is essentially this test bed for all these policies that then kind of trickle down or trickle up, I should say, to the federal government, and we've seen that replicated not only in the U.S. but in many other countries as well, in the EU, in China, and in fact, many other countries who take ideas from California on how policies should be formed end up actually being a lot more aggressive than even in California. Okay, so let's get into kind of the big one as it relates to electric vehicles, and that is the ZEV mandate. Actually, CARB doesn't like it when we call it a mandate. They like to call it ZEV regulation. Um, but ZEV, zero emission vehicle mandate, so this was regulation that was first adopted back in 1990. And the basic idea is that if you are an automaker and you sell cars in California, a certain percentage of them has to be an electric vehicle. Okay. And so in the original mandate back in 1990, they said, okay, we're going to pass this rule and we're going to say by 1998, 2% of vehicles sold have to be zero emitting. So this 2%, um, there's an 8-year kind of build-up period to allow automakers enough time to develop the technology to sell these cars. And then it ramps up, right? So 2% in 98, 5% in 2001, and then all the way up to 10% in 2003 as a percentage of new car sales. So time goes on, right? Say they have this regulatory requirements, and actually there is some activity. If you guys recall back to some of the earliest lectures, we talked about like the GM EV1, for example. So there were automakers who were producing some vehicles at low volumes, but nowhere near enough to like meet these requirements. And so as we inched closer and closer to this 1998 uh, initial requirements, CARB was like, whoa, okay, like clearly no one's going to be able to meet this. And so in 1996, they're like, okay, we're going to get rid of this 2% thing. And there's going to be this low requirement. You just have to make a couple thousand, right? So 1998 comes around, and it's just kind of clear to the regulatory agency that the technology is not ready. It's not ready for the level of market penetration that they were trying to push for. So they reduced it even more, and they increased requirements for like cleaner gasoline vehicles, like more fuel efficient, to kind of substitute away. And so they call these like partial substitute, so PZEVs, which are partial zero emission vehicles. Um, yeah, and so these, as time goes on, as we like, get closer and closer to these targets, CARB keeps realizing, well, it's clear that we're not going to be able to meet them. In 2001, they ended up further reducing the requirements, and a lot of the initial push to meet these requirements were being met by fuel cell vehicles as well, which are very expensive at the time. I mean, they still are, but back then as well. Um, a lot of stuff is kind of happening in the background especially related to fuel efficiency requirements and then eventually greenhouse gas emission standards. Both California was taking some action and the federal government was taking some action, especially with uh, President Obama coming into office. And so the actions that happened in 2008, 2009 in this transition led to some pretty big changes in the greenhouse gas well, the formation of greenhouse gas emission standards at the federal level and making fuel efficiency requirements a lot more stringent. And so the regulatory agency, they kind of viewed this as, oh, this is actually like a good time for us to start pushing harder on these technologies. And so in 2008, they pushed out this new requirement for the ZEV mandate to meet a 2014 target. And then in 2012, they rolled out probably one of the more substantial, real pieces of regulation requiring EVs to be sold. So as you guys recall, EVs start hitting the market in 2010, and they're selling. Some of the manufacturers are like all in on EVs. Some, well, I shouldn't say all in, but they are willing to mass market EVs and commercialize. Some are kind of hedging their bets and producing just a small number of EVs that are not meant for mass market in order to meet these targets. So in the 2010s, different companies are taking different strategies to meet the requirements. But in general, what we find is that they are meeting the targets and actually exceeding them. And so back in 2022, there was kind of the most recent proposal and recent update to the ZEV mandate to essentially require 100% EVs by 2035. Okay. Okay, so that's kind of a timeline for this. Started way back in 1990, long before any market was present. And I think many people would argue, and I would agree, that without this regulation, there's no EVs like anywhere. We would not be anywhere close. Tesla likely would not have survived without this regulation. And we'll talk about one of the benefits, like how this regulation has kind of benefited Tesla in a little bit. Okay, and so, yeah, the guy, Dan, the guy who made these slides, he's probably one of the more significant people who are responsible for like EVs coming to mass market, not only in California, but in all the places who've kind of followed California. Okay, so let's talk about how ZEV regulation works. We'll get into some of the nitty-gritty. I think it's kind of interesting to understand some of the policy mechanisms because we're going to see how the policy mechanisms have actually affected certain things. And it speaks to the importance of like good design, and it also speaks to how unexpected things may arise from the design that you didn't anticipate. So one, annual credit percentage requirements. So what does that mean? Let's say you're an automaker. I was kind of simplifying it before, where I say, okay, as an automaker, if you sell 100 vehicles in California, then like 5% of them have to be electric. It's not quite so straightforward. You have this 5% requirement, and that's how many credits you need to generate to meet in order to meet the standard. And then you sell electric vehicles to get credits, but actually it's not always one-to-one. And we'll see that in an example in a little bit. They had it structured in such a way that like if you didn't sell that many cars in California, like the requirements were kind of a little bit more relaxed, but large automotive manufacturers have to produce these zero emission vehicles. I don't remember the cutoffs off the top of my head. I don't know if anyone here does. I think it's like large auto manufacturer is considered like if you sell more than 30,000 a year. I think that's the number, but don't quote me on that. It might show up in the slides later. Um, you have plug-in hybrids as an option, but there's a cap on the number of credits you can generate from PHEVs. And then each vehicle earns some amount of credit. And so we'll look at the graphs of this in a little bit. And then additional provisions provide compliance flexibility. All right. So, yeah, so California was definitely the earliest leader on electric vehicles. They had the first mandate back in 1990. Yeah, just as context now, what does it look like in California? 12% of total sales in 2021, 15% in early 2022. And then just as a comparison, right, the requirements in the state of California are like 10 to 12% by 2025. So 2025 last year, I think we were closer to like 20% to 25% market share. So we almost doubled the required mandate. Greenhouse gas emission standards. These are requirements for cars to meet specific GHG performance standards. Initially adopted federally, but they've kind of flip-flopped a lot over the last couple of years. And again, this is the main topic of Monday's lecture. I mentioned that other states follow California's rules. So for the ZEV requirements, there are, I think today there's 14 or 15 states that now follow the zero emission vehicle requirements, or what used to be the zero emission vehicle requirements. And they accounted for, this is actually a little bit lower. It's closer to about 40% of the US vehicle market. So that whole provision from the Clean Air Act that let California impact other states, it is a smaller number of states, but they are states that have large populations, and so that's why the relative size of the vehicle market that this policy affects is relatively large. Okay, any questions on any of this? Okay, we'll continue on. Okay. Yeah, some more details on the different instantiations of the ZEV mandate. So 1990, that's the start of our ZEV mandate. CARB had adopted this low emission vehicle program for all light duty vehicles, and the primary focus of that was to essentially get gas cars to be cleaner, especially as it relates to like pollutants, not necessarily on carbon dioxide yet. And then this push at the same time for ZEVs because they were inherently a lot cleaner. A lot of these were with lead acid batteries, so our battery technology was a lot worse back in the 90s. We didn't have lithium ion batteries, so from a technology standpoint, a lot more difficult to meet. This is like a little small dot or point here, but is actually a fairly significant one. So there's this $5,000 penalty for each ZEV not made available for sale. So if you sold like 100,000 cars in California, and you had a 5% requirement, right? So that's 5,000. 5,000 vehicles, right, for 100,000 vehicles sold, that would be like a $25 million penalty, right, if you didn't sell those EVs. So these things can get pretty substantial pretty quickly um, with that penalty. Yeah, I mentioned how in '96 basically determined that the technology was not ready. Lead acid batteries are just not good enough for full size vehicles. At the time, we had these nickel metal hydride batteries coming out, but those were just in development. Yeah, and so that mandate was delayed until 2003. In 1998, more delays and softening of the standards. And so the ZEV mandate was decreased in compliance. More delay back in 2003. There was a lawsuit that pushed back the start of the mandate to 2005. That had to do with, yeah, some of the greenhouse gas standard language that was added that kind of conflicted with some federal policy at the time. But you can see what the phases kind of look like for yeah, fuel cell vehicles in these years. Yeah, and this is when a fuel cell partnership was established to start to try and build out some hydrogen infrastructure. We still had the 10% requirement, but it was really watered down. Only 2% of that 10% had to be from pure ZEVs, so BEVs and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Uh, yeah, I remember trying to study this in grad school. It was like enormously complicated. You had all these other like breakdowns and flexibilities that were baked into the requirements. So you could have like another 2% that could be near zero vehicles. This is like the silver standard. That could come from hybrids and compressed natural gas vehicles. And then the last 6% could be as long as they met SULAV, which is the super ultra low emitting vehicle emission standards. That would be allowed. So ZAV was like zero emission vehicles, but kind of, and you got all these like wishy-washy credits from other types of vehicles. And thank God they got rid of that like complexity later on. Yeah, but many different ways to get extra credits. The credits themselves are tradable, so this actually, while it's a regulation, it also touches back into operating kind of in a market in some ways. Yeah, and then smaller automakers don't need to meet this like 2% ZEV rule. You don't need to remember all of the details here. Just know that I think the bigger thing about this slide is this acknowledgement that that it's hard to meet these requirements and that there are other technologies that are like helping push along the way. And so the policy itself is like redesigned to try and accommodate that, right? And so we get into like more complex policy details kind of because the situation calls for it. That's why this complexity exists. Yeah, and so that's why that's how an example of the situation kind of informing the policy. Yeah, we have something known as travel provision within the ZEV mandate. So, right, I mentioned that California and a bunch of other states were participating in ZEV. Fewer states back then. It was 10 other states in the 2010s. And basically, there was this worry that, like, okay, you're spending all this money on building out charging infrastructure in California. Other states maybe don't have the same resources to make those investments. So what we'll do is we'll let California sell an extra amount of EVs, and then you can count them in other states towards their requirements. So that's known as travel. the travel provision, and that eventually phased out back in 2017. Okay, this is what I was talking about with all the like weird credit mechanisms for other vehicles. Again, you don't need to memorize this or anything. Um, okay, so this is where I think it gets a little bit interesting. So I was mentioning that percentage requirement is like a requirement to generate some amount of credits, but you can get more than one credit for an electric vehicle. So here is a plot of how many credits you can get that depend on the technology and on the range of the electric vehicle. So they built this stepwise function back in the day that operated all the way up through 2017. So this was a design so that you could incentivize automakers to produce larger range vehicles, and they would be rewarded by doing so, right? Because the idea is like, okay, I'm going to require like GM to produce an electric vehicle. They could just like produce a bunch of, I don't know, like electric golf carts, right? That really low range vehicles that wouldn't be kind of worth a lot. But we ideally would want them to be making vehicles that could replace gas cars. So CARB came up with this kind of incentive structure here. So you can see if you produce a 50-mile BEV, you would get 2 credits. If you made a 75-mile BEV, you get 2.5 credits. If you made a 100-mile BEV, you get 3 credits. All the way up to if you made a 300-mile BEV, you get 7 to 9 credits, depending on certain things about the vehicle. Okay, so does anyone see a problem with this? So let me ask you this. If I made a 100-mile BEV, how many credits would I get? 3, that's right. What if I made a 120-mile BEV? I would still get 3 credits. And if I made a 150-mile BEV, I would still get 3 credits. So there's this really fascinating thing that happens, which is if you look at cars that were produced between 2010 to 2017, guess what? The ranges were basically right at each of the cutoffs, right? So you saw a couple of vehicles that had 75-mile range or like 80-mile range, right? So the Nissan Leaf, the BMW i3, those had basically exactly 75-mile range. Like the Tesla, they would have an exactly 300-mile range, so that you could claim the right number of credits. And so this stepwise thing creates this like artificial incentive to like hit a particular target and then do no better. And we actually saw a whole bunch of EVs that were produced with very specific mileage ranges directly as a result of the way these credits were structured. Okay? I'll also note that I'll kind of re-emphasize that it's not one vehicle, one credit. You could be, if you were Tesla, you could be selling your 300-mile Model S and you could be making 7 to 9 credits. Okay, and if a credit sells, if the penalty for a credit is $5,000, and you have this market for credits, you can think of a credit that the value of a credit at its cap as like $5,000, right? So if you're automaker A and you're like, I just can't afford to build EVs, I'm just going to buy credits from other people who are building too many EVs, you could be like, okay, I'm not going to sell any EVs, I'm just going to buy some credits from Tesla, for example. I'm not gonna, and that way I can pay less than $5,000. I can make a negotiation for credits. So let's say I buy them for like $4,000 from Tesla. So that means for one Model S, I could be selling credits generated from that from a single Model S for 9 times $4,000, right? So $36,000 for every single car that I'm selling. So guess what's actually keeping Tesla afloat in the early days, right? You, Back then you hear news about like, oh, Tesla is taking a $15,000 to $20,000 loss on every Model S that they sell, right? Because maybe they sell the Model S for $100,000, but it actually costs them $120,000 to make. Well, they're losing that $20,000, but then they make that back plus more from selling these credits, right? And so, yeah, people have actually gone back and done the math on this. They used to publish the revenues that they generated from credits, and actually it was the revenues keeping the company alive in its early days. So this stepwise function, the red line that we just saw, that's equivalent to the yellow line. Yeah, so these are some examples of vehicles that we're selling back then. A lot of them are kind of right next to where the steps are increasing. That changed in 2017. To be based linearly on range, and so the number of credits that you get changed to the blue line, and then actually most recently changed to be just one-to-one with vehicles being sold in the 2022 update. Okay, so they kind of learned their lesson that maybe having a continuously increasing credit system was more effective. And then once you're in the like commercial market, right, you don't need to have this anymore. The reason being, right, the initial impetus of having this increasing credit thing is to make sure that you're producing vehicles that are big enough. Once you are at the phase where you are trying to sell these mass market, you're going to be designing the vehicles based on the consumer's needs, ideally, right? And so you don't need to have this trying to push your ranges up. Yeah, oh, yeah, we actually do have a slide on this. Yeah, so Tesla survived bankruptcy in the early days because of the ZEV credits. You can see revenue from regulatory credits in orange relative to their net income in gray. And so even out to like the early 2020s, the credit revenues were really important for the automaker, and even more so in the earlier days. Okay, so as time goes on, we were in this kind of the most aggressive, well, used to be the real aggressive, actually implemented ZEV mandate starting in like the 2008 to 2012 time period. And so in the 2010s, we would kind of describe ZEV as being responsible for pushing the evolution of EV technology onto the market. And then we had Governor Newsom's executive order that required 100% of cars are supposed to be ZEVs by 2035. 100% of all trucks, not just sales, right? So there, just to clarify, I don't recall if we had talked about this in this class yet, but there are sales and stocks, right? So sales are the cars, new cars being sold every year, and the stock are the actual cars on the road, right? So California sells 1 million cars every year, but we have 30 million cars on the road. So even if you switched immediately to all electric, it would take time for gas cars to come off the road. So 100% sales for passenger vehicles by 2035, and 100% of all trucks, like medium heavy duty trucks, not just sales, like on the road, are ZEV by 2045. And then 100% of off-road vehicles and equipment by 2035, where feasible. And the executive order, so this pertains both to executive orders made federally or by our governor at the state level. Executive orders do not have the full force of law. They are kind of like goals of the executive that get pushed down to as like a motivation for designing policy in certain ways, right? And so Governor Newsom wants to do this, and so he sets out this executive order, and it is now the responsibility of the regulatory agencies that the governor oversees to try and implement this in actual law, okay? Or, executive orders can even maybe influence the legislature to pass laws to meet some of the goals of these executive orders. Okay, so Air Resources Board now has the responsibility to figure out, okay, how do we do this? And so these are very aggressive, right? These targets are unlike anything that that CARB has tried to do before. And so to meet this, CARB pushes out an update to their ZEV mandate as part of ACC2, which is known as the Advanced Clean Cars Act. It's the second version that they kind of put forth. So has to have very aggressive ZEV sales requirements, battery warranties to protect consumers in the secondary market. So we've talked about, right, battery degradation, and so if that's a worry in the used market, which we know is really important to be able to trickle down EVs to the rest of the population, we want to think about this. We eliminated the stepwise and then that linear curve of how range relates to credits. The AER is the all electric range. Credits are still tradable. Plug-in hybrids have to have a minimum of a 35-mile all-electric range in 2026 to 2028, and then 50 miles after that. But they do get the same amount of credit as a battery electric vehicle. But plug-in hybrids can account for no more than 20% of an automaker's compliance. So if this thing was successful, fully carried out all the way out to 2035, then if 1 million cars are sold in California, you would expect 800,000 of them to be fully electric, 200,000 of them to be plug-in hybrids, and 0 of them to be gas, right? That's essentially what the ZEV mandate would have done. And then remember, this doesn't affect just California, this affects a bunch of other states, all the states that decide to opt in. And there's this whole stuff about the credit trading that we talked about before. Yeah, and there's a little extra bit about environmental justice credits. Automakers get a little bit extra credit for selling EVs at a discounted price to programs within certain disadvantaged communities, low-income communities. So EJ, that's the topic I would have talked about on Monday, and I'll provide some resources on that shortly. So the sales requirement jumps up pretty drastically, right? So 35% 2026, and then ramping basically straight out to 100% in 2035. So what are these battery warranty requirements that I was talking about? Uh, so durability and battery warranty, um, they basically said, okay, uh, you have to meet this requirement that the batteries have to be at least 80% of their state of health, of their certified range for either 10 years or 150,000 miles, whichever one comes first. Um, and if you're below that, you as the automaker, you have to offer a warranty um, for the first 8 years or 100,000 miles, whichever comes first. If the battery drops to 70% for model years 2026 to 2029, or 75% for 2030 and after, that means you have to replace the battery for free. Now remember, battery is like the most expensive part of the electric vehicle. So auto manufacturers are like heavily incentivized to like really improve the technology or be more conservative on the battery, so that when it goes into second use, um, that the degradation is not as prominent as people are worrying about. So this protects the consumer, um, and it makes sure that in the secondary market, when you have a lot of sort of middle or low income people who are finally able to get the car, that it's not like a total trash car that has like no range, right? Um, and so this is uh, one of the hotly debated topics regarding ACC2, because the idea is that if you implement this, it's going to make EVs more expensive and less affordable. And so the question is, should these requirements be adopted? And I believe they ultimately were. Other states adopting California's ZEV mandate, are they committed to do everything needed, right? Because in California, we have this huge suite of policies, not only pushing these electric vehicles, but supporting them on the demand side through subsidies, supporting them in infrastructure by supporting deployment of chargers, right? And so having just the ZEV mandate without any other policy support might be a recipe for failure. And so this idea that a bunch of other states like hop onto California's ZEV mandate without doing anything else was worrying. And so should California actually weaken its own standards in order to make it so that other states could have a better or easier time to comply? Yeah, and so this is again one of these like fundamental policy questions as you're thinking about, these are the types of issues that Dan as a board member was having to think about in passing this regulation. Um, you know, should we balance for other states or not? And so those are just some of the policy design issues, right? Other things like should we try and think about all the upstream stuff? We've talked about how the manufacturing of these vehicles on the battery side can be bad locally for some places. The cobalt and all of the humanitarian issues associated with that. What about all the emissions coming from the grid, right? Do we need to think about that in some ways? Um, should the credits only go to ZEVs? What about with PHEV? Should be the same or different? Do we care about the energy efficiency of these vehicles? Um, yeah, so a lot of topics to think about as it pertains to design. There is also this question that, a lot of folks were asking about at the time when ACC2 was being discussed and ultimately rolling out, is that do we even need ZEV anymore, right? We've seen empirically that you have the ZEV mandate in place, well, all the automakers are exceeding the requirements. So, is it really the case that ZEV is forcing them to do anything? Um, is it a technology that can now survive on its own in the market? People are looking to these analyses where how cost competitive are they with gas cars, right? In terms of TCO, we see that's already happening, but in terms of like the upfront purchase price, not yet. So when does it make sense to phase a policy like this out? And I think that CARB takes this view that just because it's cost competitive on the market doesn't mean that everyone will necessarily want it. And from the purposes of what they're trying to do, right, which is reduce air pollution and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and following this executive order to electrify, um, yeah, it's kind of irregardless of what's happening sort of on the market. And if it's the case that automakers are able to meet the requirements, without necessarily even having the policy in place, well, good, right? It's easy enough for them. They don't have to worry about the policy. And if not, then that's what you're counting on to actually push them to sell these vehicles. Yeah, so that's this kind of fundamental question here. Um, yeah, do we still need these interventions? And one of the arguments, consumers don't make decisions based on total cost of ownership. And so think about you guys or folks that are we always buying the most fuel efficient vehicles? Are we buying the vehicles because they're cheaper on a TCO basis? It's not like most buyers are actually, making decision on that basis. And so we still want to be pushing people to do this. Incentives are needed on the demand side to push for that. And so it's probably needed, we still need the incentives for kind of a long time. We'll talk in a little bit more detail about subsidies, but just to kind of give everyone some grounding and a sense of what this looks like in California, we have, or we had, I should say, a $2,500 essentially tax rebate if you bought a full electric vehicle, and a $1,500 rebate if you bought a plug-in hybrid. And that program, called the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, has kind of changed over the years. And I'll talk about how that has evolved in just a second. We also have free access to carpool lanes. And that program actually ended at the end of last year. I'm sure you guys have all seen them, right? The cars with the carpool stickers. That's all part and parcel with this kind of ZEV program on the demand side, getting people to want to buy electric vehicles. That's one of the benefits that you get is access to carpool lanes. But again, that program ended last year, and so those stickers don't actually do anything anymore. One of Dan's favorite topics when it comes to like incentives is fee baits. He says under consideration in California, although I don't know if that's really true these days. A fee bait is a really interesting program. So let me back up and motivate this for a second. So I said $2,500 per EV. Okay. California sells 1 million cars a year. If a quarter of our cars are EVs, so 250,000 EVs, and they all get $2,500 back from the government, that would be, okay, what's 250,000 times 2,500? Someone help me out real quick. it's on the order of like billions of dollars, right? Oh, 620. Okay. 625 million. So not quite a billion. Sorry, I'm bad at math. Oh, wait, 625 billion? Is that right? So 250,000 times 2,500. We add. Yeah. That makes more sense. We'll say on the order of $500 million to $1 billion a year. Okay? So that's great. We're giving subsidies to people to make it easier to buy EVs. But you're now talking about, you know, $500 million to $1 billion a year that the government has to find funding for, right? That may be coming from our general fund. That might be coming, well, it hasn't come from our general fund. It's actually come from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, GGRF, which is part of the earnings from our cap and trade program. But it's a lot of money for the government to come up with. And actually, if anyone has ever bought an electric vehicle in the last 10 years and you applied for this, like half the time you get put on a wait list where they're like, oh, we're out of money. Sorry, you're gonna have to wait until we get re-upped, and then we'll send you a check, right? And so there's this constant struggle. Sometimes they fail to get re-upped. There's always this like legislative battle for who should be getting pots of that cap and trade money, and so you know the CVRP, they're like constantly fighting to get this, and sometimes they're getting less than they're asked for, right? So it can be hard to sustain this program. So that's where this fee-based idea kind of really gets some traction. And the basic idea of the fee-bait is, okay, in California we sell a whole bunch of different type of cars. We sell clean cars, you sell these electric cars, you also sell SUVs and vans and trucks and other cars. So you can give $1,000 or whatever to someone who's buying an EV, and that could be the rebate part of it. And then you can assess a fee for people who are buying the dirtiest trucks, right? And so this guy who buys, a dirty Hummer, he has to pay a $1,000 fee to buy that Hummer, and you take the money from that fee and you give it back to whoever bought the electric vehicle. So this is a self-sustaining revenue mechanism to keep an incentive program that disincentivizes you for buying dirty cars and incentivizes you for buying clean cars. It's a pretty elegant solution. It's not like a total. It's not like a totally crazy thing. There are actually some countries that implement a fee-based program. So famously, France has one. It's called the bonus malus system. And so that's an idea that Dan is a big proponent of, but has not actually been very successful in getting traction in California, at least so far. There's a number of vehicle purchase incentives. I'm not going to go through these in detail right now because, again, we'll have a more detailed lecture about incentives later on. But just know that in addition to like what's being offered at the federal level or what was offered at the federal level, California makes some offerings here as well. Okay. So Dan has a couple of slides on fee baits. There's different ways you can design this. From the perspective of an economist, the last thing that I'll say about the fee bait is it's actually a pretty efficient program. You typically, from an economist perspective, you want to tax bad things and you want to incentivize good things. And so the fee bait kind of does this at the same time. The carbon tax is the thing that would be taxing the bad part. That would be kind of the direct mechanism for like punishing this environmental externality. Um, the fee bait is technically less kind of economically efficient because it's not directly taxing the bad thing, it's taxing the efficiency piece of it. But often is considered to be more politically palatable, maybe because it's not a tax. Um, yeah, and because it offers an incentive to certain people. The really compelling part of this for the government is that there's no cost to taxpayers, right? You don't have to rely on some external tax to generate the funds for your incentive program. Okay, maybe I'll take a quick pause here if there's any questions about any of this. All right. So he's got a bunch of slides on trucks, which I'm going to skip because we actually talked about. Um, well, okay. I'll skip some of these. Yeah, so on the medium and heavy duty side of things, there was an executive order, right, that we were mentioning. Um, so on the medium heavy duty side, part of the motivation for the ACF and ACT policies that I talked about in our previous lectures comes from this executive order where you have these pretty strict requirements. So CARB, again, is incentivized to essentially implement these targets in order to meet the executive orders by the governor. So lots of electric truck prototypes we've seen getting pushed out. Yeah, so I talked about the Tesla one. I've talked about the fuel cell one from Toyota. There's this other battery electric truck by Thor. And then they even have these catenary electric trucks with overhead wires. These are kind of interesting, compelling in some ways. You don't need to have a battery. It's like you're constantly plugged in because you have the wires carrying electricity overhead. But I'm sure you guys can imagine the like logistical infrastructure issues associated with doing something like this. But on a small scale in certain areas, it may actually make a lot of sense to do something like this. Yeah, to give you guys a sense of what the numbers actually look like over the next decade for what would have been required with these with this mandate, looks something like this. So for class 2B to 3, class 4 to 8, and class 7, 8 tractors, percentages for new sales look something like this. California targets electrification of trucks and buses. Yeah, all urban transit buses have to be electric by 2040, and all new purchases by 2028. Requires all new shuttle buses at airports be electric by 2040. 75% of most truck sales have to be ZEVs by 2035. So very aggressive, I think even more so than with passenger vehicles. Electrification in this area, very aggressive policy setting to push them to be zero emission vehicles. Not only that, large fleets have to purchase electric trucks. And there has to be a match requirement for manufacturers to sell electric trucks, right? So this is pushing on both the demand side and on the supply side. You have to produce the electric trucks for these fleets to actually buy. And that took effect in 2024. And for buses, all transit buses have to be ZEVs in 2040. 100% of sales starting in 2020, end of 2028, beginning of 2029. Lots of incentives available for, yeah, early purchases of e-buses. So that may actually help push the technology out a little bit earlier as transit agencies take advantage of some of the incentives. Um, and the LCFS credits can pay for some of the fueling costs. Okay, I haven't talked about low carbon fuel standards. This is a different policy that does affect electric vehicles, but is meant more broadly for vehicles in general, for transportation sector in general that use any sort of fuel. The way this works, so this was passed back in 2007, following AB 32. There was the legislature basically asked CARB to implement this program, and actually low carbon fuel standard. Part of the legislation that pushed this regulation or pushed for this regulation to be implemented actually asked for the University of California to do a big study on this program and what the sort of implications would be. And so the two lead people on this program was a professor at UC Berkeley, and then Dan Sperling at UC Davis. And so he was actually responsible for a lot of the research behind this program. Yeah, and so this program basically requires if you produce fuels for transportation in California, you have to essentially make your fuels cleaner over time. The use of fuels for transportation has to decrease in carbon intensity over time. So they basically required oil companies to buy credits from low carbon fuel providers, including electric utilities, because they were replacing gasoline, right, with electricity, which is generally a lot cleaner. So the credits are worth quite a bit of money, 20 cents per kilowatt hour. Yeah, and so LCFS itself established this carbon intensity standard, and then the credits that they trade help to support companies that are doing like low carbon activities, such as everyone who's doing like EV stuff. This is, yeah, this is quote unquote free to taxpayers. Although maybe I don't quite agree directly with Dan on this. So you have oil companies that have to reduce the carbon content of gasoline and to support like low carbon fuels. So no taxpayer money goes directly into the system. But where might this be a little bit deceptive? If the oil companies are paying for it, that means what? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Um, so if you've ever driven around the US and then you like enter California and you're like, why the hell are California gas prices like way more expensive than everywhere else in the country? It's partly because of this program. Okay, so everywhere else in the country right now is freaking out that their gas prices are like reaching $4 a gallon, and we're like, oh, we've been at $4 a gallon for like decades, right? We're closer to what, $7 a gallon now. And that difference is because actually, one, our blend of gasoline is different from the rest of the country. It's cleaner than the rest of the country. We have to refine our own gasoline in state to meet LCFS requirements. So, yes, it's like free to taxpayers, but our consumers are paying the price for programs like this. Um, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Well, okay, and this is like a bigger policy picture. We're doing all of these things, supporting EV programs, supporting these low carbon fuel programs, and that costs money. It makes things more expensive. That's the cost of reducing carbon, right? We think it's worth it because the damages that happen from carbon that will come to the rest of society is probably more than what we're paying for the extra costs in gasoline, right? The cost of a wildfire, like wiping out a community, uh, and happening all over the state and so on, like that's costs associated with climate change. And so our state believes that doing these things is worth it, and paying these higher prices is worth it. And yeah, I mean, if you look at the research in this area, I think you would, at least I would tend to agree. But it doesn't make things easier. And like from an affordability standpoint, that is an important thing to think about when we're developing these policies, right? We want to make sure that people aren't left behind. Okay. Um, so he closes out with these like 7 insights that I will get to in a second, but I did want to provide an update to a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about today. Where are we today with the way that the federal government is functioning? Like, can California just continue to do its own thing? Are these programs and policies still in place? So, technically, no, they are not. So, the reason why California can do this, remember, is all about um, the original allowance from Congress through the Clean Air Act that allows California to do any of this. All of these programs are built off of California's Clean Air Act. That is what gives them the authority to do this. That all hinges on the federal government providing a waiver that gives California the authority to do this. Yeah. So, technically speaking, not many legal scholars would say no. Now, when California implements something new and they ask for a waiver, that's a different question. And that has come down to political battles. Like, we saw that happening. Like, California was asking for a waiver in the Bush era, and EPA was turning them down. And then Obama comes in and he says yes. Same thing in the Trump administration. The first Trump administration, California was asking for waivers. EPA was saying no. Biden comes in, grants the waivers. Okay. Can you revoke a waiver that has already been granted by the EPA? I think a lot of legal scholars would again say, no, you can't do that. But what happened was that Congress used a special authority to revoke the waiver, the Congressional Review Authority, and most people say that it was a inappropriate use of that authority. But they did it, which means that the ZEV mandate is now gone, the truck rule is now gone, and then there's this other omnibus rule that is now, technically speaking, gone. Uh, so, because the waiver was revoked inappropriately, California is challenging that revocation in court. And we await the court decision um, to see what will end up happening with these regulations. So it's currently up in the air. In the meantime, California is using other authority that it has to try and regulate some of these things through its uh, its ability to reduce like air pollution authority. So California kind of continues to fight on in different ways, but I would say I personally think that a lot is going to rest on some of these big court cases that are coming up. So stay tuned for that. Like this stuff is all happening in the very recent past. Um, yeah, I'll give a little slide on that when we start talking about some of the federal stuff next week. Okay, so that's just like a quick update. All of these policies that I've been talking about, a lot of them are halted for now. Not LCFS, fortunately, but a lot of the ZEV ones. Okay, so let's walk through some of the insights from Dan. Yeah, EVs are the most important decarbonization strategy by far. Let's not lose sight of that, right? So all of this effort, all this detail that we're going through, this is for decarbonization, and EVs are the best way to do that. Yeah, by I think quite a long shot. Aggressive regulations are necessary. This wouldn't have happened, not all the EV market that we see today, that wouldn't have happened without the ZEV requirements. The last 30 to 50% of the market is probably going to be a lot harder than the first 50% of the market. And for that reason, we need like a continued push, an aggressive push in policy to do it. For charging infrastructure, I haven't talked so much about this. We'll cover this a little bit more. Government funding is necessary to help support this, but not sufficient. You need to make the business case for these things independently strong as well. Vehicle purchase incentives are going to be necessary. Yeah, I think to some degree that's true. I don't know necessarily how much I would agree with that kind of to the extreme, given how successful these things might be in the market. So I think we'll see. Purchase incentives are especially important for social and environmental justice. That I do agree with. EVs, if they're naturally more expensive, you want to make sure that the transition is not harming people, right? So you get rid of gas cars and you only have expensive alternatives. You want to make sure that people aren't left behind. So from the perspective of like environmental justice, I do think this is really important. And I think that's reflected by the way that they've designed incentives. And we'll talk about that when we cover incentives in a couple lectures. Okay, I'll skip that. Need better incentives that send clear market signals to consumers. Yeah, the sustainability of the incentives, as I've mentioned, is not great. And then things change and flip-flop. It needs to be continuous. And that's the kind of point that he's making here today. I think he's pushing harder for fee baits. Yeah, okay, and so that's it for today. Hopefully you guys found this insightful. There's a lot going on in California and federally, which we'll get into next time.